Good day. Today is Monday, 15th December 2025, and let me remind you before I proceed with the program to tick the like button if once you watch the program or whichever part of the program you want to watch, you decide that you like what you've heard and you want to indicate that fact. Well, the unending, tiresome saga of the so-called negotiations to end the Ukrainian war grinds on with another meeting between the Americans and the Ukrainians in Berlin. A meeting which has lasted 2 days, in which Chancellor Merz put in a brief appearance before he was either asked to leave the room or chose to leave the room. There are divergent claims as to which it was. Negotiations which, for some entirely unknown reason, the Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, also joined, at least for a time. But anyway, these tiresome negotiations between the United States and Ukraine continue. And here I am going to bring up again a point which I have made many times in the past, which my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou also makes regularly, and which he and I have just discussed in a program we have done for the Duran, which will be published shortly. And that is, these are very strange negotiations because they're taking place with one party to the conflict, but not the other. Ukraine and the United States are supposed to be allies. Everybody accepts that there is a colossal discrepancy in power between the two. The United States is a global superpower. Ukraine is not. Ukraine, by the admission of senior officials of the US government itself, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio being one, is a proxy of the United States in a war being conducted in part by proxy between the United States and Russia. And yet the United States, instead of negotiating the terms of a Ukrainian peace agreement with the other side, which is Russia, is instead devoting vast amounts of time and mental energy negotiating with whom? With its own proxy. Now, this does make the whole thing really extremely strange, at least extremely strange from my point of view. Of course, the Americans will say that they are stuck with the formula that Joe Biden made back in 2022, that there should be no agreement without Ukraine, giving Ukraine, in effect, some kind of veto over any progress towards negotiations. And, of course, the European states, which are allies of the United States, and which have also declared themselves allies of Ukraine, have joined in that formula. Though they all insist that they are not involved directly in this war, the United States has admitted that it is involved directly in this war. As I said, the US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said that it was a proxy war between Russia and the United States, but the Europeans instead insist that they are bystanders, that they are there simply to provide help to a third country, Ukraine, which is experiencing aggression by Russia, that they're not a direct party to the conflict at all. Anyway, the Europeans, who have inserted themselves into this entire discussion, even though they have never clarified publicly their own exact role in it, anyway, they too have, in some mysterious way, acquired some kind of veto over the entire process. And both Ukraine and Europe, the Europeans, are apparently able to rewrite American proposals, the proposals of one party to the proxy war, in advance of those proposals being presented to the other party in the proxy war, which is, of course, Russia. Now, all right, I'm being perhaps rather absolutist here. I mean, in reality, things are a lot more messy. Ukraine obviously does have some level of agency. So do the Europeans. The Europeans may be pretending that they're not parties to this conflict, but they obviously are. The moves they are making to try to seize, confiscate, steal, or misappropriate the Russian assets, I leave it to you to decide which of these adjectives you prefer. Anyway, the Europeans obviously are also a party to this conflict at some level. But it is nonetheless extraordinary that the Americans, that the United States, continues to give the Europeans and the Ukrainians so much as the time of day. Now, I have not myself added up all the amount of hours that the United States has spent trying to negotiate a conclusion of this conflict in Ukraine. I don't see any point or value in such an absurd and tedious exercise. But what I will say is this, and I don't have any doubts on this point at all, that the United States has spent many, many more hours negotiating with its proxy and its erstwhile uninvolved allies in Europe than it has in negotiating with its true adversary in this conflict, which is, of course, Russia. You would have thought, in the normal way of things, given that the United States is a superpower and Russia is, at the very least, a great power, and given that Russia is winning the war, and given that the United States has admitted publicly in its national security strategy document that re-establishing stable relations with Russia is a core American interest, and given that the United States is actually under no obligation to discuss what it discusses with the Russians, with the Ukrainians, or with the Europeans, you would have thought that a more conventional, a more logical way of approaching this negotiation would be for the Russians and the Americans to meet, to negotiate with each other, to come to an agreement, and then to present it to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans. And of course, the Ukrainians and the Europeans could at that point be offered a take it or leave it deal. They would probably choose to leave it, in which case the United States could walk away, or in the alternative, the United States could try to modify the agreement it had reached with the Russians. But of course, in that case, it would need to discuss that with the Russians as well. Anyway, in either case, the United States would be in a far stronger position with the Ukrainians and with the Europeans than it is at the present time. It would be able to come to them saying it had reached an agreement with the Russians. It could say truthfully and straightforwardly that for the United States coming to an understanding with Russia to stabilize the relations between the United States and Russia is a core US interest. It could say to the Ukrainians and to the Europeans that yes, the Americans might be prepared to discuss certain details of the agreement that they had reached with the Russians further if there were any particular points that either the Europeans or the Ukrainians had, but he could also make it clear to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians that ultimately the decision as to whether or not to move forward with the agreement was for the United States to take, it having agreed the matter with the Russians. Well, of course, nothing like that has happened. Instead, we are in Eve Smith territory. I say Eve Smith because, of course, it was she who talked about the fact that the West spends all its time negotiating with itself rather than with the other side. And we are in Eve Smith territory on steroids. Hours of tedious negotiations about whether the Ukrainians are prepared to withdraw from Donbass or not, whether there's going to be a free trade zone there or not, whether there's going to be a demilitarized zone there or not, whether there will be a free trade zone there or not, what is going to happen about Ukraine's NATO membership, its security guarantees, all of those things. Why does the United States need to even discuss security guarantees with Ukraine? Logically, Ukraine is not an American ally. The United States has provided a great deal of military assistance to Ukraine over the last 4 years. That has not been successful. Ukraine is continuing to lose the war in spite of all of that military assistance. The United States is perfectly within its rights to say that it has no obligations to defend Ukraine at all, that it has not defended Ukraine during the last 4 years when Ukraine has been under attack, that it has no intention of taking upon itself those obligations in future, that the topic of NATO membership is closed, that the topic of security guarantees for Ukraine is also closed. The United States could do that, and what, in that case, would the Europeans and the Ukrainians be able to say or do? Well, they could protest, they could complain, they could do all of those things, but they have no actual power, no power themselves to make a difference or to force a change in the American position. Now, I have discussed at extravagant length in these programs, as have we on the Duran, why the United States continues with this extraordinary charade of, in effect, negotiating with its own proxies rather than with the other side. Briefly, and just to repeat again, it is because the United States is not united, because the greater part of the government of the United States has by no means given up on the proxy war against Russia and is using Ukraine and the Europeans to try to obstruct any move towards peace. But then, given that this is so, and we on the Duran, way back in August 2024, predicted that it would be the case if the United States chose to take this line. Anyway, given that that is so, one wonders why the current administration bothers to negotiate at all, or to put forward peace proposals, or to conduct negotiations, or to hold long, tedious 5-hour meetings in Berlin, when these are all going to lead absolutely nowhere. At best, to a modified plan which goes further away from those parts of the 28 points that the Russians were prepared to consider, and which will be dead on arrival in Moscow, as Putin's foreign policy advisor, Yuri Ushakov, has just pointed out, and as I discussed in my program yesterday. Well, with that long introduction, What has, in fact, come out of the meeting in Berlin? I'm going to suggest absolutely nothing at all. There are lots of headlines appearing all over the media that Ukraine has agreed to give up its quest for NATO membership. But the truth is nothing of the sort. Ukraine continues to insist that it is not going to change the provisions of its constitution. The constitution states that Ukraine will one day seek and obtain NATO membership. So the commitment to join NATO is in Ukraine's constitution, and Ukraine is not prepared to change its constitution, which must mean that it is not prepared to abandon that objective. And yes, the Ukrainians, Zelensky himself, a number of other Ukrainian officials, a number of other European officials, including, by the way, Kaja Kallas, which ought to be a warning signal on this topic, by the way. Anyway, they have said that whilst, yes, it is true, Ukraine is not going to apply at present to join NATO, it recognizes that opposition to Ukraine joining NATO from within NATO itself is too strong. It recognizes that the United States is opposed to Ukraine joining NATO and that other European states are opposed to that also. Well, in light of that, Ukraine, for the moment, has shelved the idea of joining NATO. But in return, it seeks what it calls security guarantees. A security guarantee from the United States ratified by the Senate. Now, that, as I have already discussed, is a US military alliance between Ukraine and the United States, one which would commit the United States to defending Ukraine in the event that the United States attacked it. Well, quite apart from the fact that that in itself would be unacceptable to the Russians, it's not difficult to see where it leads, because the current objection the United States has to Ukraine joining NATO is that the United States does not want to take on an Article 5 commitment to defend Ukraine, which would be the case if Ukraine were to join NATO. But it's prepared, or so we're being told, to shoot that all away, or at least Zelensky is demanding that it shoot all that away, because in return for not joining NATO, Ukraine would obtain an identical Article 5 commitment by the United States to defend NATO, to defend Ukraine from the United States. And at that point, all the conditions, as soon as the fighting had ended, for Ukraine to join NATO would have been removed. The United States could not say that Ukraine cannot enter NATO because the United States does not want to take on any commitment to defend it, because by a separate treaty it would have already taken upon itself a commitment to defend Ukraine, even if Ukraine were outside NATO. And Ukraine itself would still be committed to joining NATO, because that would be the provisions set out in its own constitution. It would be only a matter of time, in fact, if such arrangement were ever made. It would only be a matter of time before Ukraine did, in fact, join NATO. Which is why, by the way, this entire proposal is going to be completely unacceptable to the Russians. obviously. So when Zelensky says that he's made a major concession and that Ukraine is not seeking to join NATO, he is in fact making no concession at all. He recognizes that Ukraine cannot join NATO today or tomorrow or next week or in a year because opposition within NATO to Ukraine joining is too strong. But he is working to create conditions which will make the situation of Ukraine joining NATO ultimately inevitable. The same applies to everything that Zelensky is saying, or saying that he's prepared to do with Donbass. The reports this morning, after the conclusion of all of these talks, say that the United States continues to insist that the Ukrainians must withdraw from Donbass. It's not clear whether this is unconditional, whether this is a demand that the Ukrainians withdraw unconditionally from Donbass, which is what the Russians are demanding. But we're told that the Ukrainians are not prepared to agree to that. They're prepared to float ideas like a joint withdrawal by the Ukrainian army and the Russian from the existing conflict line and the creation of a demilitarized zone there. But as I pointed out in my program yesterday, that in effect is a ceasefire, an indefinite ceasefire, an armistice line, exactly like the one in Korea, a concept that the Russians have consistently rejected. It would probably, by the way, also leave Ukraine in de facto control of that part of Donbass which it still occupies. In other words, as Zelensky himself, by the way, admitted yesterday, it would be, in effect, a return to the perennial demand the Ukrainians now make, and which they have been consistently making since March, that there should be a ceasefire on the existing conflict line. And incidentally, shortly before I made this program, I read in the Daily Telegraph that Ukrainian officials have been hastening to reassure Ukraine's friends in Europe, which is a euphemism for the British, that Ukraine is not, in fact, abandoning its quest for NATO membership. It is only putting off that temporarily in order to secure the ceasefire and in order, as I've said already, to create the conditions that will facilitate its entry into NATO at some future day. So there's been a lot of fast footwork here by the Ukrainian delegation, which, by the way, in Berlin includes Zelensky himself. I have no doubt that the Ukrainians have not come up with all of this by themselves. They are clearly being coached and briefed by their European allies, by the British, by the French, by the Germans, by the NATO bureaucracy, and by that extraordinary figure, Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who, as I said, at some point and for some unknown reason, joined the negotiations himself. But when you analyze it, when you take it apart, when you pass it down, you discover that in reality and on the substance, the Ukrainians have given no ground at all. They have not moved in substance by one iota. They say they have given up the idea of future NATO membership, but they demand a military alliance instead, which will lead eventually to NATO entry. They say that they're prepared to consider a withdrawal from Donbass, but they're putting forward demands which show that rather than a withdrawal from Donbass, what they're really thinking of is a ceasefire, a freeze of the conflict. And in its totality, these discussions, which took place in Berlin, have taken us no further forward. Now, I say that, I do appreciate that Steve Witkoff, the president's representative, the lead person in all of these negotiations. By the way, just on that, I am not sure whether Keith Kellogg, who is technically still President Trump's formal peace envoy, had any role at all in the meetings in Berlin, whether he was even there. The president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, was, and of course he's not even, properly speaking, a member of the administration. But the lead negotiator now is indeed Witkoff. But anyway, Witkoff says that there was considerable progress, but as far as I can see, there has been no progress on any of the key issues, any of the sticking points, and that means basically that there has been no progress at all. So I've spent again an enormous amount of time talking about all of this. In the absence of progress, we are basically where we always were. And then the question comes back, what is Donald Trump going to do? He's refusing to meet Zelensky, which is correct, by the way. He is also putting off the idea of a meeting with Putin. And I would say now that that is correct also. Does he intend to send Witkoff to Moscow? Even though, if Witkoff did go to Moscow, he would be going with empty hands. Now, last time Witkoff and Kushner went to Moscow, which is about 10 days ago, I also said in advance of that trip that they were going to Moscow with empty hands because the Ukrainians and the Europeans were rejecting everything and had basically taken apart the 28-point proposal. Well, Witkoff and Kushner got round that by spending 5 hours of discussions with Putin about the 28-point proposal or list of ideas, which of course the Ukrainians and the Europeans had previously rejected. It seems that the Americans ignored completely all the counterpoints, all the counter-proposals, all the ideas, all the amendments to those 28 points that the Europeans and the Ukrainians had made. Are the Americans going to do the same thing? Are they going to go to Moscow and meet Putin and tell Putin, well, we know you've been listening and hearing about all of these ideas that Zelensky has been putting forward, but, well, that's just him talking, that's just the Europeans talking. We are still sticking with the 28-point proposals, and let's move forward with those. Is that what the Americans are going to do? In that case, of course, they're playing a cruel game with Zelensky and the Europeans. And beyond that, I wonder why in that case they're bothering to pay any attention to the Europeans and the Ukrainians at all. Why do they waste time talking to these people if, in the end, they decide that they're not going to do anything with the proposals that these people make? Well, again, I've discussed all of this. I don't like doing this, but it seems to me that, well, my friend and colleague Alex Christoforou has referred to this as a charade, but this is what it's frankly looking like at this moment in time. To me, it's a travelling circus in which the Americans go through the motions of talking for hours with the Europeans and the Ukrainians. They then come up with proposals which they know that the Russians are going to reject. I cannot understand the sense and the purpose and the logic of doing any of this. Is it because the President, Donald Trump, worries that unless there is all of this appearance of activity, the hardliners in the Congress will insist on sanctions, 500% tariffs on India and China, which he doesn't want to enact? Is this what this is all about? I wonder how long that fiction would fool the hardliners in the Senate in that case. But anyway, would it not be, if that is the objective, much more logical, much more straightforward, much simpler at the end of the day and less time-consuming to simply call in Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal and all of the others, call them into the Oval Office, give them a detailed briefing about the real situation in Ukraine, about the real situation in the global economy, and point out to them that after 19 sanctions packages, and with a further more sanctions going to be announced by the Europeans tomorrow, with all sorts of other steps taken by the United States as well, with a history of sanctions extending all the way back to 2014, the United States has achieved nothing. It has not been able to shift Russian behavior in Ukraine, Russian policy, by a single millimeter, and there is no reason to think that any further sanctions are going to cause the Russians to shift that way at all. All that the sanctions now do is push up domestic inflation in the United States and in Europe and create tensions with America's friends or erstwhile friends, countries like India and Brazil and the other BRICS states, which are becoming increasingly disenchanted and angry and are asking why they should be sanctioned when they are not even a party to this quarrel. Anyway, would that not be a simpler, more straightforward way of doing things? Well, perhaps, but that's not what the United States is doing. Many people are talking here about 4 or 5 dimensional chess. I've never myself seen chess played in that kind of way. All I would say is that if this is 5-dimensional chess, then this is a game that has by now become so complicated that I absolutely myself cannot see the point to it. I don't think it is 5-dimensional chess, by the way. I think that this is the product of a negotiation where the lead negotiators on the American side, Trump, Witkoff, Kushner, Rubio, others, have lost the skill and the understanding of how negotiations with the Russians should be conducted, and are aware that the idea of negotiations is unattractive to their adversaries in the permanent government of the United States, the deep state, and who are therefore improvising and putting it all together from one day to the next without planning it through or working it out. Anyway, that's the state of the negotiations. Meanwhile, the Europeans, having indefinitely frozen, another bizarre euphemism, by the way, indefinitely frozen the Russian assets in Euroclear, are now discussing or preparing this week for what is being billed as a make or break meeting to get authorization from the European Council to move forward with their plan to fund Ukraine to the tune of 140 billion euros using these indefinitely frozen Russian assets as collateral. And I'm not going to discuss this in any greater length. We've done a massive video about this on the Duran, Alex and I, and I've discussed it now in several programs on this channel. All I would say is that the Europeans are talking all about this. They appear to be running into more opposition from an increasing number of the European member states. So alongside Belgium, Italy, Malta and Bulgaria, which, as I said yesterday, appear to be speaking out against this plan, the Czech Republic now is also doing so. Hungary and Slovakia, well, their opposition can be taken for granted. But some of the media coverage suggests that more and more countries, in fact, across Europe are having second doubts, and the proposals are being made to the European Council to explore alternative methods of funding Ukraine that would not do this incredibly dangerous and very unwise thing. Well, the word, by the way, from Ursula von der Leyen and the European Commission is that there is no plan B, that there is no alternative mechanism for funding Ukraine. It is either seizing the assets or misappropriating them by floating this loan, or it is presumably to give up funding Ukraine at all. And, well, one could see what Ursula and co are trying to do. They're trying to put the member states, the European member states, in a position where they either authorize the loan with all the enormous risks that go with that, or face the very real prospect of being blamed when Ukraine's finances collapse next year and the country plunges into hyperinflation. And probably Ursula and Kallas and Merz and probably Macron and all of the others are telling themselves that rather than risk being blamed in that way, all of these EU countries that are now objecting will in the end bend and will agree to what is being proposed. And of course, if that doesn't work, there is always the option, presumably, of invoking emergency powers, as has already been done. So anyway, the Europeans continue on that particular course, and in the meantime, their rhetoric gets ever more shrill. So we had an astonishing speech by the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, several days ago. He spoke wildly about Russia being a permanent adversary of NATO and of the West. He said that it wasn't just the Russians who are now this massive destabilizing factor in international relations. China is almost as bad, all bad as well, apparently. All sorts of other countries are becoming very bad. And NATO really must hold the line in Ukraine and build up its forces, because it is surrounded on all sides by enemies, and the Russians are coming, and it has no choice. Meanwhile, Friedrich Merz, Chancellor of Germany, for just a few months, now more unpopular even than Keir Starmer is in Britain. I've seen the opinion polls, and he actually is. Incredible that as that seems, goes on telling young Germans that they must enroll in the German army, the Bundeswehr, and prepare to fight Russia. He talks also about how the Pax Americana, the American peace, is now coming to an end. He seems to have taken the US National Security Strategy document particularly badly, by the way. But anyway, he's talking a lot about that. He's becoming increasingly critical of US economic policy, the tariff policy. He seems to be blaming the Americans increasingly for Germany's economic problems, which I have to say I find completely bizarre. Anyway, the economic conditions in Germany continue to get worse. I understand that industrial production in Germany is now 20% below its 2018 peak. Obviously, there was the pandemic, which caused production to fall. But normally, after the pandemic ended, you would expect to see a gradual or even a rapid recovery. Instead, we continue to see further and further decline. And, well, all kinds of excuses are being given by any number of people as to why this is so. So Merz is now hinting that it's the American tariffs. Others say it is the embrace of green technologies by Germany and German governments. Others say it is overregulation within the European Union. There is some truth in some of this, but of course the real proximate cause is the economic war against Russia, the decision to impose sanctions on imports of Russian energy, of natural gas and oil, the decision to end the imports of Russian natural gas and oil entirely, and the higher prices that this has caused, which have led to European industry, in particular German industry, becoming uncompetitive. Now, of course, there are other factors. Chinese competition is indeed very strong, but then competition is always there. It is a fact of life. It is something which all economies, all businesses need to take into account when they make their decisions. In my opinion, the overwhelming reason why we see this crisis in Europe, this economic crisis in Europe, is, yes, first, the economic war against the Russians, and secondly, the continued operation of the euro. The euro has by itself already caused deindustrialization in many of the European countries, France, Italy, and of course some of the smaller countries in the Mediterranean region as well, Greece, for example, Spain, others. And the reason is that the euro has locked all of these countries into an uncompetitive position relative to Germany. And even as the euro weighs down on these other European economies, Germany itself has undermined its own competitiveness relative to the rest of the world by embracing much higher energy costs. As I said, there are other factors at play. I'm not disputing it. But those two seem to me by far the most important. And notice that in the media commentary today, nobody talks about the economic war as being responsible for Europe's economic descent, and nobody either talks about the euro anymore. During the Eurozone crisis in 2011, many people spoke about it. Now, as far as I can see, nobody does. Just as discussing the effect of the economic war on Europe has become politically forbidden, almost a taboo, so discussing the role of the euro has become a taboo subject also. So there we are. We are locked in to a situation of permanent decline. And there is no real way through, because when the Americans come forward with proposals and present them to the Europeans, and it is truly astonishing that the Americans come up with proposals and present them to the Europeans at all in the first place. As I said at the start of this program, we in Europe, together with our Ukrainian friends, work round the clock to sabotage them and to subvert them and to shoot them down. So anyway, that's where we are. We're going round in a circle. If you want a perhaps more vivid metaphor, think of what happens when the plug is pulled in your bath. You see the water swirl round and round and round, as eventually it goes down the plug hole. Well, that, it seems to me, is what we're doing in Europe, first with Ukraine, but perhaps also in the end with ourselves. And of course, we talk about war. We talk endlessly about war with Russia. Nobody, by the way, who talks in this way generally truly believes that there is going to be a war with Russia anytime soon. As Medvedev, the former Russian president, who is now, of course, the vice chair of Russia's Security Council and of its Military Industrial Commission, recently pointed out, all the European leaders know perfectly well that if there were an all-out war between the Russians and the Europeans and the West, it is inevitable that nuclear weapons would be used. And they all know that were such a thing to happen, it would be curtains for them. Curtains for a significant part of humanity too, perhaps most of it, perhaps even all of it, but definitely curtains for them. And these are people who are not blessed with a suicidal disposition. So we are not going to get a war between Russia and Europe. The European leaders who talk about this don't believe in this themselves, but of course they engage in this rhetoric so that they can all remain united with each other, and so that they can keep this whole operation, they can hold it together just for a little bit longer, even as it continues to fall apart. Meanwhile, the Russians watch and wait. They tell us that they've not yet received any revised proposals from the Americans. They say that they assume that someday the Americans will provide them with the revised proposals and the results of whatever it was that the Americans discussed with their proxies, their Ukrainian proxies in Berlin. If, as the Russians have already said, as Ushakov said yesterday, as I discussed yesterday, the proposals that the Americans come up with, the revised proposals, deviate from the American understandings that had previously been reached in Anchorage, at the Anchorage summit. Well, Ushakov himself said that in that case, the Russians would not hesitate to reject them. Anybody who thinks that the Russians would be too embarrassed to reject obviously unacceptable proposals which are obviously unacceptable to them, I think is profoundly mistaken. I think the Russians are beyond that embarrassment anymore. I think they no longer care what the West thinks about them, and they've gone to great lengths to explain their position to their global south friends and their BRICS partners. That was what Lavrov's great speech and long speech, his monumental speech to the global south ambassadors, from whom, by the way, he also took some questions in the foreign ministry, which I discussed 2 days ago. That was ultimately what that was all about. So if newspapers in the West, if politicians like Macron and Starmer come out with statements attempting to score points against the Russians, about the Russians not agreeing to peace, about the Russians sticking to maximalist positions, all of those things, well, the Russians by now simply don't care. And again, this is perhaps something that some Western leaders don't understand, some European leaders don't understand, and perhaps should do so. There is no point in trying to score points off the Russians in these sort of debates anymore, because the Russians are not engaging the Europeans in those debates. It is not for the Russians. This is not a debating society, a debating game. It is a war which they consider existential to themselves and about which they have already set out their position, which they do not consider maximalist, and which they have shown no sign of ever wanting to derogate from. Anyway, again, as I said, I spent a huge amount of time talking about all of this. It is sometimes wearisome to do, but there we are. I don't know what comes next. I don't know whether Witkoff and Kushner will be flying to Moscow, whether they will speak to Trump, whether there will be more negotiation sessions between them and the Ukrainians, whether the Ukrainians are going to be asked to reactivate their negotiations with the Russians in Istanbul. I don't know what exactly the Americans are going to do. But as far as I can see, despite what Witkoff says, they have made no real progress at all. Anyway, there it is. We'll also see what the Europeans do this week about the Russian frozen assets. More likely than not, the answer will be no at the level of the European Council. Too many states will oppose this ill-starred project, but that doesn't mean that it will die. More likely than not, as I said, we will see it brought back in some form, more pressure applied on the EU states, perhaps a resort to emergency powers. But one way or the other, I have no doubt that it will be done. Meanwhile, the war rolls on. And, well, a lot of the media attention is on Kupiansk, which I will come to later. But Kupiansk is only one part of the conflict line. In my opinion, the most important news, apart from the fact that the Russians are continuing to pound Ukraine and have launched major strikes against Ukraine, but the big news is coming from the Western fronts, as the Russians would say, the front lines in Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk region, where the Russian tide is increasingly looking unstoppable. Now, we got reports yesterday, was it the day before, that the Russians had captured the village of Varvarovka, north of Gulyapolye. There have been more reports that they have captured more positions on the west bank of the Gaichur River. And today, the Russian Defense Ministry said that the Russians have captured another village called Peshanye, more like a small community, I understand, a small town, which is actually located in the Dnipropetrovsk region, but which is also on the Gaichur River. Now, over the last 2 or 3 weeks, as the Russian army advanced to Gulyapolye and to the Gaichur River, there was a lot of talk about this strong defense line that the Ukrainians had created on the west bank of the Gaichur River. And it was all tied together with various villages, and pictures appeared showing dragon's teeth and barbed wire, and there was some claims and some commentary that the Ukrainians had created in this area their own version of the Surovikin line, the great fortified barrier that the Russians created in Zaporozhye region in advance of Ukraine's 2023 summer offensive, and which defeated that summer 2023 offensive. Well, I have never taken these claims that the Ukrainians created anything that remotely approximates to the Surovikin line seriously. And if the latest reports are to be believed, and of course I am not there, but I'm just deriving information from what the various other sources say, well, it looks as if this entire defense line is crumbling. The Russians reached it. There's been about 2 weeks of fighting, and it looks like it is already cracking and collapsing. I suspect the primary reason for this is that though the Ukrainians hurriedly put together this defense line, the vast belts of minefields that the Russians created in 2023 prior to the Ukrainian offensive were never created. It seems as if Ukraine no longer has the capacity to produce and lay mines on that kind of scale. And the Ukrainians also anyway probably never created a defense line with anything like the kind of density that the Surovikin line has. And of course the Russian army is much more powerful, far better organized in attacking a defense line like this than the Ukrainian army was when it attacked the Surovikin line, or tried to reach rather the Surovikin line in the summer of 2023. So this entire front line is crumbling. It looks like a dam. The maps make this whole area look like a dam. You see the huge areas now of Russian control to the east, and they go right up against this fortified wall. And you've now started to see the cracks where the Russians have broken through, and the individual villages and positions that they've captured in Gulyapolye and west of the Gaichur River and along this fortified line. And you can see that it's going to look like a dam. The cracks will widen, they'll start to link up, and the whole wall, the whole dam will fall. And the Russian forces in this very area will then move westwards like a tidal wave. To me, and I say this, it looks more like a tidal wave now than a lava flow, because the speed is starting to build up, and build up more like what you would expect from a tidal wave than from a lava flow. And as numerous people have pointed out, as many people have pointed out, there are no defenses comparable to this defense line that the Russians are breaching east of the city of Orekhov. And Orekhov anyway is only one place and likely to be surrounded very soon. And beyond Orekhov, there is absolutely nothing at all to hold back the Russians east of the Dnieper River itself and of the city of Zaporozhye. To repeat again, if the Russians reach the river, if they reach the Dnieper and Zaporozhye city itself by the end of the winter, I personally would not be surprised. I am not predicting that it is going to happen. I don't know what the Russian plan is. It may be that they don't intend to move that fast for any number of reasons, which I myself, lacking information as I do, cannot guess. But to repeat again, if they do reach the river by the end of the winter, and they are camped outside Zaporozhye city, at that point, I myself will not be surprised. Now, the Ukrainians also are facing multiple problems in all sorts of other places too. In Mirnograd, the Russian Defense Ministry is again dropping hints that the Battle of Mirnograd is just about ended. And there's been more revisions, by the way, to the maps that the Ukrainians themselves have been providing of the Mirnograd pocket. And now it clearly appears encircled by a thick belt of Russian territory on every side. It's a cauldron. The Ukrainians are isolated inside it. It doesn't look as if there is, in fact, any possible escape route. And from what I can tell, the Ukrainians have basically abandoned all attempts to create escape routes. This is what the Russian Defense Ministry, by the way, has said about the situation in Pokrovsk, Mirnograd. The group of forces center continues to hit positions of the enemy in Mirnograd, as well as to mop up areas from scattered Ukrainian troops near Svetloye, Grishino, and Rodinska. Scattered Ukrainian troops near Svetloye, Grishino, and Rodinska. That strongly implies that those three villages, Svetloye, which is located between Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, it's a small village to the west of Rivne. Grishino, a much bigger village to the northwest of Pokrovsk, from which the Ukrainians were conducting various counterattacks earlier in the Battle of Pokrovsk, but which the Russians are known to have entered about a week ago. And Rodinska, an actual town located to the north of Pokrovsk, which the Ukrainians, by the way, have at various times suggested that they were on the brink of fully recapturing from the Russians. The Russians now speak of fighting scattered Ukrainian troops near all three of these. It is looking as if the Russian Defense Ministry is preparing soon for the moment when it's going to announce that all three of these places, Svetloye, Grishino, and Rodinska, are under complete Russian control. And I suspect that once that announcement has been made, we will see an announcement very soon after that the Mirnograd pocket has also collapsed and that the entire territory of the Pokrovsk-Mirnograd conurbation is under complete Russian control. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. I have discussed the importance of Pokrovsk in many programs. It has recently been suggested, and I believe that it is true, that the main road from Dnipro, the city of Dnipro, which passes through Pavlograd and on through Pavlograd to Pokrovsk itself, and from Pokrovsk to Konstantinovka, and then from Konstantinovka to Chasov Yar, and then onwards towards eventually Bakhmut and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk, that once the Russians have captured Konstantinovka, as well as Pokrovsk, This entire road can then be repaired by the Russians and can then become a key part of their own logistics. That makes perfect sense to me. And of course, if that is correct, if the Russians have a big modern highway at their disposal, then that will facilitate their military operations across Donbass and will enable them to supply their troops if those troops decide to advance westwards to the Dnieper, to the city of Dnipro, or more plausibly northwards to encircle Slavyansk and Kramatorsk. Anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. Less information about Konstantinovka. We don't know, I don't know, whether the Russians have indeed achieved more than 50% control of Konstantinovka, as their commander said. He expected they would do by mid-December. To repeat again, I am not there. But there is no doubt that the Russians are indeed fighting within Konstantinovka itself. And exactly as I anticipated, by the way, the Russian forces, having captured Seversk, appear to be pressing forward towards Rai Alexandrovka and towards the city of Slavyansk, though I do not myself think that there is an intention on the part of the Russians to assault Slavyansk and Kramatorsk head on at this time. Now that leaves the situation in Kupiansk. And again, and especially over the last 24 hours, a lot of commentary, a lot of talk about the situation in Kupiansk. I should say that a group of Ukrainian bloggers, I believe they were bloggers, attempted to go to the same area 2 kilometers to the west of Kupiansk, where Zelensky briefly appeared and had his picture taken about 2 days ago. And they noticed the pictures that they took of the stela that you could see close in the background behind Zelensky appears to have damage. That could have happened any time in the period after Zelensky was there. But perhaps more interestingly, this group of Ukrainian bloggers who were there had to run away very quickly because Russian drones quickly appeared, which strongly suggests that that territory, at least, is not securely controlled by Ukraine. Again, it begs the question of what Zelensky thought he was doing there and the risks he was taking. But then Zelensky has repeatedly shown that he's prepared to take extraordinary risks, including with his own life, in order to achieve a successful media operation. Anyway, I am not going to discuss in detail the situation in Kupiansk because there are lots of contradictory reports. For the record, this is what the Russian Defense Ministry says about the situation in Kupiansk today. It says units of Group of Forces West continue to inflict fire damage on an encircled enemy group on the left bank of the Oskol River. Russian troops hit manpower and hardware of 5 mechanized brigades, 2 assault brigades of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, one territorial defense brigade, and 1 National Guard brigade near Kupiansk-Kuzlovoy, Glushkovka, Monachinovka, Shikovka, Blagodatovka, Padali, and Krasny Liman, which is, of course, unrelated. The last place is completely unrelated to the fighting around Kupiansk. The key point here is that the Russian Defense Ministry continues to insist that this group of what they claim are 15 battalions of Ukrainian troops on the east bank of the Oskol River remains surrounded. Now, for that to be true, the Russians must control western Kupiansk, in other words, on the west bank of the Oskol River. What I suspect is happening is, yes, the Ukrainians are conducting a media operation and they're sending small groups of fighters into Kupiansk itself, where the Russians defeat them or have to round them up, or at least fighting like that takes place. But plausibly and probably, the Ukrainians have also been conducting counterattacks in order to try to rescue their troops who are trapped on the east bank of the Oskol River. It's not so very different from what has happened in the Pakrovsk area, where the Russians have had to repel multiple attacks by Ukrainian troops from Grishino heading west, advancing eastwards towards Mirnograd in an attempt to extricate the Ukrainian troops there. So that's probably the military logic behind this. According to some Russian channels, the Ukrainians have concentrated a significant force in this area. And, well, you can see what the Russian Defense Ministry is saying. 5 mechanized brigades, 2 assault brigades, 1 territorial defense brigade, and 1 National Guards brigade. That's by my calculations, around 8 brigades in total. 5 mechanized, 2 assault brigades, 1 National Guard brigade, all in this one area. In fact, 9 if you add the territorial brigade as well. Probably, though, none of these brigades are in fully up to strength. So there's clearly a significant force there. But there was also in Pakrovsk too, when the Ukrainians were trying to break through to Mirnograd. The attacks to try to relieve the forces in Mirnograd were unsuccessful. The Ukrainian attacks have ebbed away. I suspect the same will happen with the attacks in Kupiansk too. And as happened with Toretsk, with Dobropilia, with the area of the Dobropilia salient north of Pakrovsk, as has happened in so many other places, as happened in Bakhmut, by the way, also, after that town was captured. Anyway, we will see eventually these attacks melt away, and when the dust settles, we will find Kupiansk again firmly under Russian control. Anyway, now, more pertinently, I've now had a lot more information from a very reliable source about Russian losses. These are Russian losses, not Ukrainian losses, just to say. And I will make one quick observation here. The source in question is very well informed, but he is not Russian and he is not Ukrainian. And he is, I would say, generally fairly neutral between the two. And, well, that's all I'm going to say. Anyway, he has his sources of information, and I'm absolutely not going to discuss what they were. And he's provided me with a figure for Russian losses up to the 1st of January of this year. And this figure is very much lower indeed than the various claims that have been coming out of Ukraine and which have been repeated by governments in the West. But what I will say is that it is not out of line with the media zona estimates. So, just to say. Now, having said that, this source is in contact with various medical facilities across Russia who are involved in providing support, medical support for the Russian armed forces. And the information that he has conveyed to me exactly corresponds with the information provided on the Duran when we did our program a few days ago with Joao Quereda, I think his name was. Anyway, this information about what he saw when he visited medical stations. Joao Quaresma, let me just correct that. So what Joao said is that he has been to Russian medical stations, and far from seeing the great flood of casualties that we would be expecting if the Russian losses were anywhere near as high as is being suggested by Ukraine and by Western governments, what he saw was a trickle of losses instead. Now, the information this source is getting is exactly the same. Now, it's rather more interesting in some ways, not more interesting, but there is some background. The worst period that the doctors and nurses in these casualty stations experienced, the worst period was basically from the summer of 2022 until midsummer 2023. This was when men were badly wounded and dying men were passing through the stations, the casualty stations, in huge numbers. Since then, that has steadily trended downward. And, well, I think he would say it is more than a trickle, but it is significantly reduced. Now, if that brings us back to what I suspect for the Russian army was the most difficult and bloodiest battle of the war up to now by far. And that was the Battle of Bakhmut. Now, at the time, I was skeptical about some of the claims about massive losses that the Russians were suffering during the fight for Bakhmut. And I always questioned whether they could possibly be higher, as many claimed, than Ukrainian losses. Well, as to the second part, I was right. Ukrainian losses during the Battle of Bakhmut were even greater. Indeed, a Russian military officer a day or so ago said to TASS, that the Russian news agency TASS, that the Ukrainians are very, very short of men in the southern Kharkov, northern Donbass region, precisely because they have never fully recovered from their losses in this area during the Battle of Bakhmut. But it seems as if Russian losses were extremely high as well. And I'm not going to explore the reasons for this. I suspect some of the way in which Prigozhin, the Wagner chief, who, as I've discussed many times, was not a trained military officer, conducted the operation, might have led to Russian casualties being much higher than they might otherwise have been if it had been the professional Russian army conducting the operation, commanded by a competent professional commander. Anyway, the point is that the Russians suffered very heavy losses during the Battle of Bakhmut, but since then, the trend has been downward. There have been upward spikes. There was a significant upward spike during the first part of the Battle of Avdiivka, for example. This has not been told to me by this latest source, but I think it is generally acknowledged. And there was another spike during the Kursk fighting. But overall, the trend has been firmly downward. And, well, the organizational and administrative and logistical problems that the Russians were suffering earlier in the war have now been basically overcome. So, the situation on the Russian side is better than it was, and the Russians are suffering far fewer casualties than they were. The source gave me his estimate of what Russian casualties currently are. I've seen it. I think it is authoritative, but consistent with my practice. I'm not going to repeat it. Anyway, that's the Russians. Now, this source also has his own understanding of what Ukrainian losses are. And he has some of the same information sources about these. And in summary, he believes that throughout the war, Ukrainian losses have been 4 to 7 times greater than Russian. Now, that is something that in the West would be immediately rejected. It's consistent with what the Russians, however, have been claiming, and it is consistent with the prisoner exchanges and the exchanges of bodies that have been conducted between the two sides. And I should make it clear, by the way, that this source does not guesstimate Ukrainian losses from these two things, prisoner and body exchanges. Anyway, this person, who's authoritative and I think particularly well informed, as I said, he believes Ukrainian losses are between 4 to 7 times higher than Russian ones. And he believes that on present trends, if the war continues at the current level of intensity, then the Ukrainian army will probably collapse, will finally collapse around midsummer 2026. That from that point on, the crisis will become so great that it would no longer be possible for Ukraine to sustain the war. And he says that he believes that no amount of financing or weapons deliveries are going to change that picture. Now, I know how this person has obtained this information from the Ukrainian side. I will reveal that he has also been in touch with people who operate medical facilities for soldiers in Ukraine on a similar scale to the ones in Russia, I would add. But I am not going to say more because obviously this was a private discussion and I must keep the identity of this source confidential. Anyway, there it is. So this, it seems to me, is the proper metric to follow in the war. The events on the battlegrounds, the movements on the battlegrounds are important. If the Russians are able to encircle Donbass by the end of the winter or the spring, which I don't think is impossible, then that would be a massive event. If the Russians reach the Dnieper and are able to begin a siege of the city of Zaporozhye and even capture it, that too would be a huge thing. But it is a war of attrition that the Russians have quite intentionally chosen to wage since at least the autumn of 2023, probably from earlier still, and it is the war of attrition which they are now decisively winning. So anyway, I thought I would say all of this. Of course, the way attrition works is that it starts slow, but then it begins to build up and acquire momentum and move faster and faster. And I believe we are well into that stage now. So summer of 2026 might turn out to be too optimistic for Ukraine. As Witkoff and Kushner and Trump continue this elaborate charade of meeting the Ukrainians, meeting the Europeans, coming up, negotiating on their own proposals, even though, as I said, the party that they're going to have to negotiate with in the end is not their own proxies, but the Russians. Anyway, even as all of that is going on, Ukraine's life is ebbing away. Maybe not the entire Ukrainian nation, but the life of its armed forces. By any objective measure, they are in a critical condition. And every day you get more information that appears to confirm this. And that, incidentally, also means that whatever the nature of the attacks that are taking place in Kupiansk now is, those attacks cannot be long sustained. It is absolutely time for Ukraine to make peace. And as I discussed in my program yesterday, Istanbul Plus is certainly harsh, but it still preserves the Ukrainian state. There is no guarantee that in a month, 2 months, 3 months' time, as the Russian army continues to advance, the Russians won't have further hardened their position. So, the best thing for the Americans to do is for them to tell the Europeans and the Ukrainians, look, we understand that you're not able to negotiate. You've got all these issues and principles. But in your own interests, we've now made a decision. We're going to talk to the Russians. We're going to accept Istanbul Plus, and you can take it or leave it. It's up to you. That, I think, is what an American government generally concerned about Ukraine and the fate of its people and its future as an independent country would be doing. Will they do it? Of course not. But anyway, again, I can suggest it. It's for others to decide. This is where I finish today's program. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Please remember also to check out our new Substack page. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.